Tonight at 10, the Ukrainian military says it's making significant progress against the forces of President Putin. In the region around Kherson city, the Ukrainians say that they've advanced 5 miles in a day, liberating 12 settlements from Russian occupation. We'll also be reporting on the reaction in Russia to the news of the military setbacks, and we'll have the latest from the Ukrainian port of Odessa.
Here, the Ukrainians are celebrating a significant victory with a lot of caution, and that's because they fear a Russian trap as their soldiers push forward.
Yes, more from Jeremy Bowen in a moment, and we'll be asking where this leaves the Russian military strategy. Also tonight, much longer waits for cancer care. The number of people waiting more than 2 months for treatment has doubled since 2018.
The delay in him being diagnosed meant that he possibly could have been given some kind of chemotherapy, which would have given us some more time with him.
Why private security firms are being used on some farms as police are accused of failing to tackle crime in rural areas. 11 days to the World Cup, and England unveils the 26-man squad for Qatar. And on the eve of Remembrance Weekend, 3 veterans of the Second World War share their memories of global conflict.
In London, we take a look inside the capital's crumbling hospitals. Plus, strong words from the senior barrister on the final day of the Grenfell inquiry.
Good evening. 9 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, senior figures in the Ukrainian military say they're making significant progress against the forces of President Putin. Russian forces have admitted having problems with their supply lines, and they've been actively engaged in establishing new defensive positions. Now, all eyes are on the southern port of Kherson, which is a strategically vital city for both sides. Russian forces say they are in the process of leaving Kherson. Now, the Ukrainian army says it has made significant gains around Kherson, advancing 5 miles, they say, in the last 24 hours, liberating up to 12 settlements from Russian occupation. In contrast, Russia says that it's moving to new defensive positions on the other side of the Dnipro River, but that process could take quite a few weeks. And so far, there's no sign of a mass Russian withdrawal. Now, in a moment, we'll have a report from our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, on how the news of the Russian withdrawal was reported back home today. First, we're going live to the Ukrainian port of Odessa on the Black Sea, where our international editor, Jeremy Bowen, is waiting for us. And Jeremy, just a thought from you to start on how the Ukrainians are looking at this current situation, what they make of it.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Well, they've got a lot to be pleased about at the moment. This is a very important victory for them, and they're pushing forward into farmland that the Russians have controlled for months now. They're not getting yet, as far as we know, towards the city of Kherson itself, and they're doing it cautiously because they're worried the Russians could be setting some kind of a trap, perhaps putting mines in the city itself, perhaps getting them to a place where they might be forced into urban warfare, or in a place where they might be shelled from the positions the Russians are retreating to on the opposite bank of the river.
You mentioned the Russians there. There's been some debate today about what exactly their movements are, whether there is some kind of trap being envisaged by them. What do you make of that and the reaction that there's been?
Well, I think, of course, the Ukrainians are correct to be cautious because the Russians are going to try and hurt them as much as they can, as often as they can, as their forces go back. But I think, as far as the Russians are concerned, there's if you like, a couple of extreme scenarios, a range of scenarios. One of them is, for the Russians, the worst one, a disorderly retreat, leaving their forces bunched up at crossing points on the river and very vulnerable to very accurate Ukrainian shell fire. The other extreme, the good scenario for the Russians, which clearly is the favorite, in Moscow is that they managed to carry out an organized fighting retreat, which is something their military skills have not yet suggested they could do. But if they could do that, then they would be able to transfer equipment and men onto the opposite side to their prepared positions. And then the Russians would say, look, hang on, this may look like a defeat, but actually we are in a better position than we were because of the river. Now, what do they make of all this in Moscow on state TV and in the streets? Here's our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg.
What are Russians being told about the war in Ukraine? For more than 8 months, the message from the Kremlin to the people has been Russia will be victorious. And yet, there is no sign of the promised victory. On the contrary, the public is learning of problems. Grim faces on state TV as Russia announces a retreat from Kherson, the strategically important Ukrainian city. I bet they're cock-a-hoop about this in the West, he says, but we have to remain calm. And this Kremlin supporter remains confident.
Of course we will win. And withdrawal of our troops, temporary withdrawal of our troops from Kherson in order not to be surrendered is not a defeat. Even though a lot of people in the West would like to see this as a defeat, it's not. Because sometimes you need to go back one step to go 10 steps further.
Still, it does feel like Vladimir Putin has been trying to distance himself from what many see as a setback. As the retreat was being announced, Putin was shown visiting a brain research centre. He thought his military operation in Ukraine would last days, not months. But it hasn't gone to plan. There is also growing confusion over his objectives in this war. And since the Kremlin had insisted that occupied Kherson would be Russian forever, the retreat is a blow to Moscow. Russia's retreat from Kherson creates a danger for Vladimir Putin. It risks changing how he's perceived here at home, not so much by the Russian public, but by the Russian elite, by the people around him, the people in power here, who for years have viewed Putin as a great strategist, a winner. Less so now. And the mood on the streets? Of course we'll win the war, he says. When have Russians ever lost?
I really hope that Russian soldiers will come back and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin will leave his post and Ukraine and Russia will be free from this dictator.
For now, the Russian public is watching, waiting, to see where the Kremlin's war goes from here. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Let's turn to the day's other main story. There's been a sharp rise in the already long waits for cancer therapy in the past 4 years, according to analysis by the BBC. The number waiting longer than the target time of 62 days in the past year has passed 69,000 across England, Northern Ireland and Scotland. That is twice as many as the same period in 2017-18. Waits are also getting worse in Wales, but the current data doesn't go back that far to make the comparison. There have also been record waits for patients in A&E in England. Our health editor Hugh Pym is here with more details. Hugh?
Yes, Hugh, the latest figures for October highlight the dire situation in many hospitals in England. Nearly 44,000 patients waited more than 12 hours in A&E on trolleys or chairs after a decision to admit before a bed could be found, a big increase over the month. In England, the number treated or assessed within 4 hours of arriving at A&E was 69.3%, a record low and way short of the 95% target last hit in 2015. In Scotland and Wales, the latest available figures were broadly similar, with Northern Ireland lower. BBC analysis has shown a sharp rise in long waits for cancer therapy in the last 4 years. The number waiting more than the 62-day target time for referral by a GP to the start of treatment topped 69,000 in England, Scotland and Northern Ireland in the latest 12-month period. We've been speaking to some with their own experiences of cancer.
How are you?
Annabelle, it's lovely to see you.
Peter meets his lung cancer surgeon, Annabelle.
Here I am, still alive and everything.
Good.
She removed a large section of his right lung at the end of August. He's now receiving a course of chemotherapy.
Today, how are you?
I'm very well, actually. I feel a bit of a fraud and I feel so good. And
His prognosis is optimistic.
really, the scar is so small, it's taking half a lung out.
Yes, it is a squeeze to get it out through a small hole like that. But yeah.
After Peter was diagnosed, he was referred to the One Stop Lung Clinic here in Greater Manchester.
Kath, what have we got from this morning's assessment?
It meant that in one day his treatment plan, surgery or radiotherapy, was decided after appointments with several specialists.
What I've got from this one-day clinic is brilliant. So when I left here, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And my mind, my mind was at rest.
Peter's treatment time was speeded up, but the 62-day target from GP referral was missed. As for Keith from the West Midlands, he died with pancreatic cancer before he even saw an oncologist. His daughter Rebecca says he deteriorated because of hold-ups in his treatment.
The delay in him being diagnosed meant that he possibly could have been given some kind of chemotherapy, which would have given us some more time with him.
She says he was also a victim of long A&E delays.
He was taken to hospital at 9 o'clock in the morning and wasn't actually taken into the hospital until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The oncology team were aware that he was outside. They said that he had to be triaged through A&E, which doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Becky, who's a nurse at Colchester Hospital, recognised her symptoms for pancreatic cancer early.
I was very, very lucky to be diagnosed very quickly.
Her life was saved by getting major surgery fast, but she's worried about others.
I'm really concerned about the winter pressures on the hospital. If they don't have an intensive care bed available, then their procedure gets delayed. Therefore, their treatment gets delayed, or it might get to the point where we can't operate because the tumour has progressed too much.
Back at the lung clinic, lead consultant Matt agrees that rapid treatment is vital.
Is that 62-day target really becoming very, very difficult to meet?
So for lung cancer, days matter. It can be, sadly, an aggressive form of cancer. It does feel challenging, but the solutions have to be making gains at every step of that pathway. Yeah, he's not breathless at all, is he?
Here they're aiming to cut waits for treatment. NHS England says more patients are diagnosed early, but delays remain elsewhere in the system. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Now, if you visit the BBC News website, you can find out how your local hospital trust or health board is performing on cancer referrals. The address is bbc.co.uk/news, or you can get there by using the BBC News app. More of the day's news. A man has been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of a former girlfriend who died more than 20 years after he set her on fire. Stephen Craig had already spent almost 19 years in jail for the attack on Jacqueline Kirk in Somerset in 1998. But following her death in 2019 from complications linked to her injuries, he's been found guilty of her murder. Now, some farmers have resorted to using private security firms to protect their crops and farming equipment because they say police are not tackling rural crime properly. Suspects are almost 25% more likely to be charged for crimes in urban areas than in the countryside. That's according to BBC analysis of police data in England and Wales. In the latest of his special reports on crime, our special correspondent Ed Thomas has been to parts of Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire to look at problems in rural areas.
Tonight, we investigate the rural crime wave involving organised gangs.
Scary, actually. All we're trying to do is feed the nation when you've got all this rural crime going on.
We reveal offences in the countryside are solved far less frequently than in cities.
Yeah, we had one farmer who had his dogs nailed to the front of his barn because the farmer went to the police.
And hear from farmers relying on private security left desperate.
I have a gentleman on the farm with a gun and I have dialed 999 and I never got the police here. We're always being tested, definitely, 100%. What I'll do is I'll take you to the other side and I'll show you some of the issues.
On patrol with Luke. He says in the past year he's faced at least 30 crimes.
We've had generators stolen, we've had batteries stolen off machinery, pieces of stainless steel. If it's not bolted down well enough, they'll come and cut it out and take it anyway.
Not one has been solved. The problem is that his confidence is so low, sometimes he no longer rings the police.
This was hit at 60 miles an hour.
60 miles an hour?
Yeah, the cars that were driving over the fields hit it with such ferocity, it ripped this post out. Within about half an hour of them being on here, they'd driven over about £16,000 worth of crop.
So now Luke spends 2 hours every day securing his 4,000 acres.
Of all those crimes, how many people have been in the dock found guilty of the crimes?
None of them.
Not one?
Not one.
Cambridgeshire Police told us in the past year there's only been one police report sent from Luke and his farm. But he disputes this and says other workers on his land call police to report crime.
This was a car that was caught coursing on the farm.
Now Luke relies on WhatsApp messages from a network of farmers.
It's daily.
He's also fortified his land and has private security patrols at night.
I've had armed trespass. I have a gentleman on the farm with a gun, and I've dialed 999 and I never got the police here. I had a gun on the farm and the advice on the call centre was don't go near them.
Our investigation found that suspects are almost 25% more likely to be charged for crimes in urban areas than in the countryside.
What is the level of demand like?
I can't keep up.
Mark installs CCTV on farms across Cambridgeshire. He's never known a time like this.
Ridiculous. From theft of GPS equipment, theft of tractor parts, metal theft. I've never been asked to secure grain, and this year I've now been asked to secure grain stores. Usually we brush past them because it is literally grain.
Do you think criminals are worried about being caught by the police when they're going onto farms?
Not at all. Yeah, we had one farmer who had his dogs nailed to the front of his barn because the farmer went to the police.
What message do you think they're trying to send?
Don't mess.
Right, lads, police are on the way.
This was filmed in East Sussex. The fly tippers were spotted before driving off.
Thanks very much.
We heard repeated claims from farmers organised crime gangs are targeting their land.
The stress of it, to be honest, that's the worst part.
Evie had £60,000 worth of sat-nav equipment stolen in a night.
Is that there?
Yep, so that's the tractor that I said the roof got taken out of.
And what was the police response like?
They said they would send the forensics team, but they didn't come till 2 days later. Put it down to sat-nav theft. I had leaflets through the post for don't leave your sat-nav in your car, and I was so offended by that.
Police say they fully investigated the crime here.
I just quickly discovered from sort of farming Twitter.
Frustrated, she turned detective and discovered dozens of other victims.
There was actually another 30 of these tractors that had had the same thing happen to them. Exactly the same, in fact.
30 in one night?
Yeah, so that makes me think, you know, there's a lorry or a van or a boat or something waiting somewhere that's been filled up with this equipment, as I say, stolen to order.
Now she feels vulnerable to organised crime gangs.
I'll go and drive the tractors at night and I'll be there in the dark on my own, and if, you know, I don't want to be faced with these people. It's scary, actually. All we're trying to do is feed the nation, and that becomes quite difficult sometimes when you've got all this rural crime going on.
The Home Office says forces have plans to tackle the challenges of rural crime, but many told us they felt like the forgotten victims left behind. Thomas, BBC News.
The inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire in West London, which claimed 72 lives back in 2017, ended today after hearing 400 days of evidence over the past 2.5 years. The lead counsel to the inquiry, Richard Millett KC, said it had ended as it started, with a merry-go-round of buck passing by cladding and insulation manufacturers, building industry professionals and local and national government. It's hoped a final report and recommendations will be published in about a year's time. Civil servants, including driving test examiners and job centre staff, have become the latest to vote to strike in a dispute over pay, pensions and jobs. Their union warned that unless it receives substantial proposals from the government, it will announce a programme of sustained industrial action. Well, with more details, our employment correspondent Zoe Conway is with me to tell us more. Zoe.
Thanks, Hugh. This is shaping up to be a winter of industrial strife. 100,000 civil servants, including Border Force staff, planning officers, have voted to strike over their pay and conditions. Yesterday, the Royal College of Nursing announced its first ever national strike. They could walk out before Christmas. Today, the Prime Minister said the union's demand for a 17% pay rise is not affordable. In total, 1.5 million public sector workers are voting over whether to strike this winter. In hospitals, that means everyone from cleaners, porters, managers, nurses and junior doctors. But it's not just health. Teachers and university lecturers are also considering taking action. In the private sector, around 200,000 private sector workers are already striking. So far this year, postal staff have walked out over 8 days, while rail workers have striked for more than 12. Many workers are striking because their pay isn't keeping up with inflation, which is now at just over 10%, and it could rise even higher by the end of the year. This year, private sector pay has risen by 6.2%, while public sector pay has gone up by 2.2%. But ministers are warning that big pay increases could push inflation up even higher. If all these strikes go ahead, then this could be the biggest industrial action this country has seen for decades. Hugh.
Zoe, many thanks. Zoe Conway there, our employment correspondent. Let's turn to some football news, and England start their World Cup campaign in just 11 days' time in Qatar. And today the England manager Gareth Southgate named the 26-man squad. There are a few surprises, as our sports editor Dan Rowan tells us.
And it is in from Harry Kane. At successive major tournaments, England have been a force to be reckoned with. Semi-finalists at the last World Cup and then runners-up in the Euros. The team have since gone 6 matches without a win, but having announced his squad for Qatar today, the manager told me he remained confident.
I'm not really concerned about the form from the summer. That we were looking at players, we had to rotate the squad, so results were inevitably at risk when you're doing that. What we've got is great experience of tournaments, and our aim is to take the country on another journey.
These are the 26 players Southgate has selected. 3 goalkeepers have been named. The established Jordan Pickford expected to start. Among 9 defenders, Arsenal's versatile Ben White is included. Meanwhile, in midfield, despite just 1 cap, the clamour for Leicester City's James Maddison has been answered. And up front, among the 7 strikers, another inexperienced but informed player, Newcastle's Callum Wilson, is in. And Rashford has missed. Having not played for England since the Euros' final defeat last summer, Marcus Rashford is back, as is Manchester City's Calvin Phillips, who only returned from shoulder surgery last night ahead of a first ever Winter World Cup.
There's no question injury has influenced our squad selection, and some of that injury has come because of the density of the matches, because of the unique nature of this season. Before Russia, we had, I think, 28 days with the team. We've got 4 days on the training pitch effectively this time, so much harder.
Meanwhile, amid a build-up overshadowed by concerns over the treatment of migrant workers and the criminalisation of same-sex relationships, FIFA has urged teams to focus on the football.
It's quite clear they'd rather that you didn't talk about human rights. Is that naive?
I think it's optimistic of them. I think we've always spoken when we've felt it's appropriate. I don't see that changing.
Captain Harry Kane will wear a rainbow armband in Qatar as part of an anti-discrimination campaign, and Southgate says his team won't be silenced.
We collectively have spoken about the desire for a migrant workers centre, the desire to help compensation for the families of migrant workers who've lost their lives. But also I think we've got to be realistic about how much the players can actually affect, and it's for the English FA and for FIFA in particular to try and make some of that change happen.
England leave for Qatar on Tuesday, but before that, there's one final round of Premier League matches. For fans, players and the manager, a nervous few days awaits. Dan Rowan, BBC News, St George's Park.
Some cricket news, and England have reached the T20 World Cup final after a stunning 10-wicket victory against India in Australia. They won the match with 4 overs remaining. They'll now face Pakistan in the final on Sunday. Our correspondent Joe Wilson was watching.
The Adelaide Oval is a striking example of modern cricket architecture. For some of the most celebrated modern cricketers, India were expected to hit sixes, but in fact, they struggled. Missing their fastest bowler, the unfit Mark Wood, England clung on to everything.
And has it been taken? It has!
Adil Rashid's catch to dismiss Virat Kohli. Hardik Pandya concluded India's innings with belatedly some big hits, added up to 168. So England's batters, chasing the final under the most intense scrutiny, did it easily.
And that's a clean strike.
Alex Hale set the pace with his sixes and England never slowed. Jos Buttler joined in. England were playing a different game, actually the perfect game.
Oh, what a shot that is.
They got to their victory total with a six, without losing a wicket, with 4 overs to spare.
And they've given India a real hammering here.
The finals on Sunday against Pakistan. England are playing like champions. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
With every year that passes, there are fewer survivors still alive to tell of their experiences in the Second World War. The youngest of the veterans, now in their mid-90s. This coming Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, will be the first for King Charles to lead the nation's tributes to those who fought for freedom and to defeat the forces of fascism. Our special correspondent Alan Little has been to meet 3 of those surviving veterans.
There was an advertisement saying, Britain needs you. And we as loyal members of the Empire thought it was definitely good that we were required to go and help the mother country.
I couldn't possibly leave the scene. It was a matter of complete life or death to me.
I really became frightened. I had a prayer book with me, a book of Psalms, which I did make use of, I must admit.
Neil Flanagan grew up in Jamaica. He was one of thousands of West Indians who volunteered. He joined the RAF and sailed to Britain to work in aircraft maintenance.
People from the Empire and the Commonwealth died. Many of my colleagues who volunteered to be air crew died as rear gunners and as engineers during the war. We had no choice but accept death as a part of the way of life.
Christian Lamb joined the Women's Royal Naval Service. She worked in signals, keeping track of North Atlantic shipping convoys. She was plotting the progress of her fiancé's ship when it was attacked by German U-boats.
I knew that they were involved in this terrible battle, and I had thought, having just managed to catch hold of this man, I'm now going to let him go. Of course, it was terrible anxiety, but I couldn't possibly leave the scene. It was a matter of complete life or death to me, and I stayed there waiting for information, hoping for information, and then when eventually he arrived in Canada, he was able to ring me up and say he'd arrived safely.
What was it like taking that call?
Well, it was amazing, of course, and you know, we just both felt, well, nothing you could say. Just thank goodness, thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Mervyn Kirsch joined the army. He took part in the Normandy landings.
And shortly I saw the outline of France, and that was the first time I really began to realise what I was going into. The adventure ceased to be an adventure, and I became frightened.
His war ended in Germany, where, himself Jewish, he witnessed the horrors of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp.
Seeing the people, mostly men we saw, in their uniforms, the striped clothing, and their physical condition. Those who could walk, they were thin as anything, their faces were thin, their arms were just bone. That was the horror of seeing them.
They are a remarkable generation. The courage and sacrifice of their youth, bequeathed to those of us who came later, the world we grew up in.
I think a lot of us were very juvenile before the war, and this gave us an enormous amount of independence, I think. It helped a whole generation of people my age. And we were, from that moment on, we chose what we did. We didn't have to do what our mothers said.
I think I made a contribution in some small way to make Britain safe and sound today, that I still live in and enjoy.
Neil Flanagan there, ending that report by my colleague Alan Little. We Were There is a BBC News project to collect as many first-hand accounts as possible of the Second World War by the year 2025, which is the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. So if you or someone you know might be willing to share an experience or a story, please visit the BBC News website and search for We Were There, and you will see the links there to leave the experience or the story. So thank you in advance for that. It's 10:30 and Sarah's here with the weather. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Hugh. Well, it's been another very, very warm November day, hasn't it? We've had temperatures above 17 degrees, but it's also been drier than of late, particularly across parts of southern England. This was the picture as the sun went down in Ramsgate, Kent, a little bit earlier on. We have had some wet weather across the northwest of the UK, and there's more of the same to come over the next few days. For Armistice Day tomorrow, then, we're still looking at exceptionally mild weather continuing. Still wet across the far northwest, and it's going to be another fairly windy day. But those brisk winds are coming in from the south or southwest, so drawing in all this mild air from the Azores and North Africa, streaming up towards the UK. We've got that weather front sitting in the far northwest, so still a bit of rain to come through this evening, clearing away from Northern Ireland, but quite heavy and persistent for the northwest of Scotland overnight. Now, elsewhere, the temperatures are the talking point. So typically this time of year, we'd expect overnight lows between about 3 to 6 degrees, but they're at about 13 to 15 at the moment, so a good 10 degrees above average for this time of year. So then we start off on that very mild, fairly cloudy note. We've got more rain to come for the northwest of Scotland. This band of rain will then track eastwards across Scotland and Northern Ireland through the day, becoming lighter and patchier as it does so. England and Wales looking largely dry, odd spot of drizzle towards the west. But look at those gusts of wind, 30 to 40 miles per hour for many of us, touching 50 miles per hour across Scotland and through the Irish Sea. 17 degrees are top temperatures for most areas, but could be as high as 19 across the northeast of Scotland for Armistice Day on Friday. Now, heading through Saturday, that area of rain still with us, but clearing to the north of Scotland, so a lot of dry weather. Early mist and fog across England and Wales, clearing away through the day, so lighter winds, more sunshine, pretty warm again, 17 or 18 towards the south. And for Remembrance Sunday, the weather for most of us looking dry and settled, again some mist and some fog, which should clear away. Lighter winds by this stage, a bit more sunshine as well. Still, temperatures pretty warm for the time of year, not as warm as Friday, but highs between about 13 to 17 degrees. Turns wet and windy, Hugh, into next week though.
OK, Sarah, many thanks once again. Sarah Keith-Lucas there with the weather. That's BBC News at 10 on Thursday the 10th of November as we approach Remembrance Weekend. More analysis of the day's main stories on Newsnight coming up with Victoria Derbyshire, which will just be coming underway on BBC Two. And it's Kirsty, actually. There you go. It's not Victoria, it's Kirsty. So she'll get me for that. And here on BBC One, it's all of our colleagues, of course, in the nations and regions ready for the news where you are. But from all of us on the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.